There is a quiet list every American family carries without ever writing it down. It is the list of small, reliable fixtures of everyday life that a parent once took for granted, and that are now disappearing one by one, so gradually that most people only notice when several are already gone. Today we are counting 12 of them, starting with the easy ones to spot, and ending with the one that changes how an entire generation sees its own future. Most people watching this are doing so on a television screen rather than a phone. So a quick, honest note before we start. If this channel has been useful to you, subscribing genuinely helps it keep going. And sharing this video with someone who has noticed these same changes matters more than you might think for where this channel goes next. Now, number 12. Number 12 is the bank branch on Main Street. For most of the 20th century, a town without a bank was almost unthinkable. The kind of fixture that sat between the post office and the hardware store on every block. Today, branch closures have outpaced openings nearly every quarter since 2010, and the pace roughly doubled after the pandemic, leaving total branch counts down more than 5% nationwide since 2020. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Vermont have all seen sharp growth in so-called banking deserts, places where the nearest physical branch sits 10, 15, sometimes 20 miles away, for an older customer trying to deposit a check, untangle a fraud charge, or simply ask a question face-to-face. That distance is not an inconvenience. It is a wall. Curiously, a handful of banks have responded by sending mobile branch vans into underserved counties, a strange modern echo of the traveling peddler who once carried goods to towns the railroad never reached. It is a small sign, easy to miss if you already bank from your phone, but it marks a quiet retreat of physical infrastructure from entire communities. The kind of retreat that rarely gets debated in public because no single closure feels significant on its own. Curiously, researchers have noticed that closures tend to start in places that already had several branches within a short radius, which means a town can look, on paper, perfectly well served right up until the moment it suddenly is not. And the next sign is when most drivers feel every time they shop for something new. Number 11 is the $20,000 new car. For years, the Mitsubishi Mirage and then the Nissan Versa held the line as the cheapest new vehicles in America, each priced near $20,000 and aimed squarely at first-time buyers. Mitsubishi discontinued the Mirage, and Nissan ended production of the Versa in December. Today, the cheapest new car on sale is the Hyundai Venue, starting just above $20,000, while the average new vehicle now sells for roughly $49,000, a figure that still equals about 7 months of the median household's entire income. Almost exactly the same burden buyers carried back in 2020. Automakers have quietly stopped building for buyers at the bottom of the market, chasing the far bigger margins available on trucks and SUVs instead. And analysts now openly worry that lower-income households are being priced out of new car ownership altogether. The result is a market that increasingly excludes the very people who most need a dependable car, simply to get to work on time. And it is not just new cars disappearing from the affordable end of the lot. The next sign shows up in the driveway, not the showroom. Number 10 is a car that gets replaced before it wears out. Or rather, the disappearance of that habit entirely. American vehicles have never been older. The average car or light truck on the road is now 8 years old, the 8th consecutive year that figure has climbed. And for the first time since the early 1970s, the number of passenger cars in operation has dropped below 100 million, as buyers gravitate toward SUVs and simply keep what they already own running for years longer than they used to. High prices, both new and used, have made replacing a vehicle on a normal 5 or 6 year schedule something only the comfortable can afford. For everyone else, the neighborhood mechanic has quietly become a more important relationship than the dealership ever was. And auto parts retailers report a steady rise in demand for repairs on vehicles well past the age that used to mean retirement to a junkyard. And from the driveway, the next disappearance takes us somewhere people visit even more often: the pharmacy counter. Number 9 is the pharmacy down the street. Since 2010, the country has lost roughly a third of its retail pharmacies. Rite Aid closed every remaining store after a second bankruptcy filing. Walgreens has been closing hundreds of locations and plans to shut around 1,200 more by 2027. In Haber-Overgaard, Arizona, a small town tucked into the White Mountains with no stoplight and a population near 3,000, the only pharmacy left is the one a local pharmacist deliberately reopened so residents would not face a 2-hour round trip just to refill a prescription. In Howard, Kansas, 2 longtime residents in their 70s describe in plain terms what losing their county's last drugstore would mean. A 100-mile round trip for medication they need every single month. A trip that becomes nearly impossible once driving itself becomes difficult. Nearly 1 in 7 Americans now lives in what researchers call a pharmacy desert, and the communities hit hardest tend to be rural, older, and lower income, the same places already losing banks and dealerships. What used to be the single most accessible form of healthcare in America, the one you could walk into without an appointment, is steadily becoming one of the least accessible. Pharmacists who study the trend point out something easy to overlook. A pharmacy desert is often defined not by miles, but by comparison. An area where it now takes longer to reach a pharmacist than it does to reach a grocery store, which used to be almost unheard of in American retail planning. And healthcare access shows up again in our next sign, in a much quieter, much more personal way. Number 8 is the local newspaper. Since 2005, nearly 40% of America's newspapers have closed. In the past year alone, 136 more shut down, a rate of more than 2 a week. And for the first time, most of those closures hit small, independently owned papers rather than big chains. The very outlets residents trusted most precisely because the people running them lived down the street. The 141-year-old Chesterton Tribune in Indiana folded after more than a century of covering town council meetings nobody else would. So did the Eagle Times in Claremont, New Hampshire, where the town's mayor now says residents increasingly get their information from unverified posts on social media, instead of from a reporter who actually sat through the city council meeting and checked the facts afterward. Roughly 50 million Americans now live in a county with only one local news source or none at all. When the only person watching City Hall disappears, so does a particular kind of accountability that most communities never realized they depended on until it was already gone. In Bell, California, officials reportedly raised their own salaries for years with almost no reporter in the room, until a Los Angeles newspaper eventually exposed it. A pattern researchers now treat as a fairly predictable consequence of an empty press table at city council meetings, not an isolated scandal. And the next sign is one that millions of adults quietly admit to, usually without telling anyone, not even their own doctor. Number 7 is the regular dental checkup. In a 2025 national survey, dental care was the single most commonly skipped form of healthcare in America, ahead of doctor visits, prescription medication, and even mental health counseling. Among adults who report an unmet dental need, the overwhelming majority say the reason is simply cost, not fear, not inconvenience. Dental coverage rarely comes bundled with health insurance the way it once seemed to, and many plans cap annual benefits low enough that a single procedure exhausts the entire year's allowance in one visit. The result is a slow, invisible erosion. People waiting until pain forces an emergency room visit instead of a routine cleaning. A pattern dentists describe as one of the clearest markers of who can and cannot afford preventive care anymore. It rarely makes headlines because nobody photographs a missed appointment. And there is no closing day ceremony for a cleaning that simply never gets scheduled. Dentists who track this say the giveaway is rarely a dramatic complaint. It is a patient quietly admitting they have not been in for 3 or 4 years and hoping nothing has gotten worse in the meantime. And from the body, our next sign moves to the kitchen, where a much smaller and more familiar kind of swap has become the new normal. Number 6 is the name brand product in the shopping cart. Store brand set a sales record in 2025, reaching nearly $283 billion and growing almost 3 times faster than national brands did over the same year. Over the past 5 years, private label dollar share has climbed from about 19% to over 21% of the entire grocery aisle. And for the first time, higher income households are switching just as often as budget-conscious ones. Not because store brands feel like a compromise anymore, but because retailers like Aldi, Trader Joe's, and Walmart have made their own labels genuinely desirable, rather than merely cheaper. What started as a recession habit during years of sharp inflation has hardened into a permanent shift in how Americans shop. A quiet renegotiation of brand loyalty that most shoppers do not even register happening cart by cart. And the next sign is something that used to come standard in a family home and is now treated as an upgrade. Number 5 is the guest room. The median new American home shrank to about 2,150 square feet in 2024, the smallest in 15 years, down from a peak above 2,400 square feet roughly a decade earlier, while townhomes now make up a record 17% share of new single-family construction, nearly double their share from before the last recession. Builders point to land costs, lumber costs, and labor costs all rising at once. But the deeper story is that the extra bedroom, the home office, the space for a visiting parent or a grown child between jobs, has quietly become a luxury line item rather than an assumption baked into what a normal house includes. Smaller lots and narrower floor plans are redrawing what a starter home even means, sometimes leaving builders designing deep, narrow footprints just to fit a livable layout onto a lot a third smaller than it would have been 20 years ago. And the next sign has nothing to do with houses or shopping carts. It is about whether a single unplanned bill can knock a household over entirely. Number 4 is a financial cushion for emergencies. For 3 consecutive years, the same number has refused to move. 37% of American adults say they could not cover a $400 emergency expense using cash or its equivalent. That figure improved steadily for a decade after the 2008 recession, reaching a low of 32% in 2021. And then it snapped back and has been stuck ever since, even through years of historically low unemployment, which tells researchers something uncomfortable about how little a strong job market actually protects a household budget. More than a quarter of adults now report having zero emergency savings at all, the highest share recorded since 2020. A $400 threshold sounds almost trivial, roughly the cost of a car repair or a single hospital copay, which is exactly why researchers chose that number decades ago. It was meant to be a test nobody should fail. And the next sign is what happens when that fragile cushion meets the very real needs of an aging parent. Number 3 is caring for an aging parent without going broke. 63 million Americans are now family caregivers, a 45% increase in just a decade. And nearly a third of them are sandwiched between a child still at home and a parent who needs daily help, a share that climbs even higher among caregivers under 50. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a sales representative named Dana Bice spent more than $162,000 in a single year on round-the-clock home care so his bedridden mother could die in her own bed instead of a nursing facility, eventually moving back into her house himself just to help cover the cost. In Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Carla Romagnano watched her parents' savings run dry after 2 years of paying for in-home care for her mother, then took over the caregiving herself when her father died unexpectedly, days before a planned move that might have eased the burden. The average family caregiver now spends over $7,000 a year out of pocket on top of their own household bills. And nearly half report some major financial hit from it: new debt, drained savings, or worse. What used to be handled quietly within a family, almost invisibly, is becoming one of the largest unpaid, unrecognized financial burdens in the entire country. And the next sign belongs to the generation just starting out, the one watching all of this unfold before they have even managed to leave home. Number 2 is moving out and staying out. Roughly a third of Americans between 18 and 34 now live with a parent, a figure approaching the pandemic-era peak and far above anything recorded for most of the last 60 years. In New Jersey, the rate climbs above 40%. In Connecticut, it is not far behind. Nationally, Young men in this age group are noticeably more likely to still be living at home than young women of the same age, a gap researchers have tracked consistently for decades. Housing costs, stagnant entry-level wages, and the simple math of saving for a deposit while paying rent have turned what used to be a brief, slightly embarrassing stretch right after college into a years-long, increasingly normal stage of adulthood. For many families, the spare bedroom we talked about earlier never actually becomes a guest room. It just stays a child's room, indefinitely. The door sometimes still decorated the way it was in high school. And that brings us to the one sign that quietly sits underneath every other sign on this entire list. Number 1 is the simple belief that life would be a little easier than it was for your parents. Economists who study generational income mobility found that 92% of Americans born in 1940 went on to earn more than their own parents did at the same age. For Americans born in 1984, that number has fallen to almost exactly 50%. A coin flip. Half of the country can expect to do better than the generation before them. Half cannot. That single statistic is not really about money at all. It is about an assumption so deep that most people never bothered to say it out loud. The assumption that effort and time would reliably add up to more than what came before. The way it had for nearly every generation since the Second World War. For the first time in modern American memory, an entire generation is being asked to recalibrate that assumption from the ground up, often quietly, often without anyone in the family ever using the words out loud. None of these 12 signs, on its own, would feel like much. A closed bank branch here, a discontinued car model there, a missed dental appointment nobody mentions at dinner, a store brand box of cereal that nobody at the table even notices anymore. But stacked together, they describe something larger than any single headline could. A country quietly renegotiating what an ordinary life is allowed to include. None of this is about blame, and very little of it is permanent. Communities adapt, habits shift, and new versions of stability eventually take shape. Just not the versions anyone expected a generation ago, and not always in the places anyone would have predicted. So here is the honest question worth sitting with after a list like this. Which of these 12 have already found their way into your own life, quietly, without you ever giving them a name? And if a list like this exists for the country as a whole, it almost certainly exists in a sharper, more specific form for wherever you happen to live. That is exactly where we are headed next, back into a single American city, to see which of these same signs are showing up first, and which ones are arriving there faster than anywhere else in the country.